Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for having me. It's really important that we're discussing climate justice, and that we're also thinking about it from a global perspective. I think, climate justice or climate action often starts at home, but if it ends at the border, then it can wither into a form of climate nationalism, I suppose. And so today, what I'm hoping to briefly talk to you about is the need for a global Green New Deal or a global, transformative vision of climate justice. We've seen in places like the United States and in the UK talks about the Green New Deal, about really a economy-wide transformation of society that puts climate, environmental, social, and economic justice at the heart of that vision. And I think there's a big question that comes up is, does that Green New Deal vision begin and end in those countries, or does it extend and enable a global vision of what that Green New Deal looks like? And I think in a lot of the discussions around the Green New Deal, it has been a more limited national focus, and I think that brings some significant shortcomings. So I could go on a big book-long spiel about what a global Green New Deal looks like, but I thought a way to maybe highlight the importance of this would be to compare vaccine nationalism and Green New Deal nationalism, and to show the shortcomings of both when it comes to global health on the one hand, and then climate justice and climate action on the other. So when we're thinking about vaccine nationalism in the context of COVID, but also more broadly, what we're seeing, if you analyze, how vaccines are being rolled out, is that the global north has, to a significant extent, bought out the majority of vaccines such that they will see, their populations vaccinated well in advance of the global south, which will take many more years to achieve full vaccination, right? And the problem with that is that, what can occur is that in the global south, while the global north is maybe reaching herd immunity, we still have COVID sort of breaking out in countries in the global south, which then leads to lockdowns in the global south, which impacts the global economy and which can also then spread back to the global north. And what's another worrying element of it is that you potentially seeing mutations of COVID. So if there's not a strong vaccination program globally, you start to see vaccinations we start to see mutations of COVID in the global south that might occur, which might then undermine the vaccines that have been rolled out. And we're seeing that in real time now with what's being called the South African variant actually being resistant to some of the vaccines, or the vaccines not being very effective in inoculating against it. And such, South Africa has actually had to cancel one of the big vaccine orders that we put in, the major one. And so this is a real worry that if we have this vaccine nationalism, in the end, we end up undermining a lot of global health, and it's not as effective. And so really, if we're going to fully fight COVID-19, we need a global vaccine drive and global vaccine justice. And similarly, if we want to fight climate change, we really need a global Green New Deal. We can't have just action at home. And a lot of the reasons are parallel, right? If you find that the global north is only investing in renewable energy and transformation at home, it makes it difficult for the global south to be able to make those sorts of investments. And if the global south is not able to invest in a Green New Deal, the pollution and the problems don't stay in the global south, just as COVID doesn't just stay in the global south, given our interconnected economy. That pollution, that climate change impacts are going to spread globally. And if you look at forecast on emissions, the biggest future growth in emissions is projected to come from the global south, unless we do enact something like a global Green New Deal, unless we do facilitate the sorts of investments that are needed in order to ensure that the global south can move away from fossil fuels and invest in a different sort of future and leapfrog the sorts of harmful, extractive, and polluting development that the global north has undertaken, right? So when thinking about that, one of the first steps that we could highlight is the need to stop flows of fossil fuel finance coming from the global north to the global south. And so there's a lot of financial institutions, whether it's development banks, whether it's public finance money, or whether it's private banks that are basically sending lots of money from the global north to the global south to fund fossil fuels. And so one of the major elements of that is to stop the funding to fossil fuels. But that's not enough. So we did see Boris Johnson has been making some positive noises about stopping, public funding in the UK from funding fossil fuels abroad. And that's a good first step, but it's not quite enough when we think about what does it mean to really invest in a global Green New Deal. And I think here, what we really need to think about is the difficulties that a lot of lower income countries in the global south face in being able to invest in the sorts of Green New Deal style policies that can help transform an economy. A lot of them in the long term are really good investments, investing in renewable energy, investing in public transportation, investing in energy efficient infrastructure and housing. All of these things lead to much better long-term gains, both economically, in terms of public health, in terms of society-wide justice and equality. These are really good investments that should be made, right? And so the question might be, why can't the global south just invest in this in themselves? And I think the problem comes in when we look at the upfront investment costs of a global Green New Deal. So just as in COVID-19, we've seen countries in the global north being able to put in place huge stimulus packages and major regulation and so on in order to deal with the COVID crisis. The global south, that's been very difficult to have because many of the economies are indebted significantly. And so they aren't able to raise the sort of capital that is needed to invest in their public health systems, to invest in a really robust response to COVID, and to invest in stimuluses to help their economies, which are flagging, right? And similarly, when it comes to a global Green New Deal, because the investment costs are really high upfront, even though the benefits are much more significant in the longer term, it's quite difficult for countries in the global south to be able to make those investments needed to really ensure something like a global Green New Deal. And when we think about the sort of debt that a lot of countries in the global south are facing, I think we can't shy away from the histories of colonialism and the ongoing legacies of neo-colonialism, which have left a lot of countries in the global south quite deeply indebted and unable to make these investments. So we can think about what the first Prime Minister of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, called neo-colonialism, where even though formal colonialism ended in many countries in Africa and in other parts of the world in the 1960s or around that time or later or earlier, depending on the country, that formal political independence didn't always equal economic independence, where there was still a lot of economic colonial shackles on countries. And so they were unable to pull themselves out of the economic difficulties that they were left in by sort of colonial masses, and had to indebt themselves significantly in order to fund those sorts of investments. And so a lot of that legacy lives on in terms of why many countries in the global south are significantly indebted. And so a big question at the heart of the global Green New Deal is not only ensuring climate finance flows to the global south and ensuring that global north countries are enabling that, but also about whether we can cancel the sort of debt that is inhibiting global south countries from making these sorts of investments. And there's sort of the other side of debt that comes in, because while there's a formal financial debt owed often by the global south to global north institutions, there's a debt that's not properly recognized, which is the climate debt and the colonial debts, and often they're interlinked, that the global north owes the global south. And of course, I'm talking in broad generalizations, and we can go into details about how we think about that debt if we had a longer talk. But generally speaking, the global north has been the one that has been predominantly responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, right? But they're also among the least vulnerable given the sort of wealth and geographical location they have, whereas the global south, being the least responsible for climate change, is often the most vulnerable given their more vulnerable status, being lower income, also due to geographical factors. And so that creates a bit of a climate debt that is owed to the global south and that often isn't being paid, or when it is being paid or recognized in international spaces like the UN climate negotiations, the amounts that are being given are quite small, or they come in the form of loans rather than in the payment of a debt, right? And so they're further indebting those countries rather than paying a climate debt back. And so a big question comes, I think, for us as global climate justice campaigners, if we want a Green New Deal to be a global Green New Deal, can we make investments needed in the global south? You know, in the Biden administration in the US talks about 40% of their investments going into marginalized communities, those that, you know, are vulnerable in the transition to fossil fuels, those have been overlooked and harmed by pollution previously. And so that sort of principle is good domestically, but there's arguably a case, if justice is indeed a global principle, that sort of analysis should be extended globally, particularly for countries like the UK and the US, which are massive historical emitters and are disproportionately responsible for climate change, particularly proportionate to their population size and so on. So I think that's really at the core of a lot of what the Global Green New Deal is about recognizing the really significant financial needs that the global south will face, both to invest in a global Green New Deal, but also to deal with the devastating impacts of the climate crisis, which many countries in Africa, and South Africa is a little bit of an exception here because we're quite a big polluter as well, but across broader African continent, many countries are barely responsible for contributing to climate change, but will be facing devastating impacts. For example, just across the way from us, Mozambique is experiencing another cyclone after a year where they saw two cyclones on top of each other, some of which wiped out entire cities pretty much. And instead of receiving climate reparations and major aid influx, what we're seeing instead is companies like Total are trying to do a major gas rush off the shore of Mozambique there to extract oil and gas, and compounding an unjust situation, and is leading to conflicts. And so I think what we see is that, you know, the countries in the global south not only have a bill for trying to shift to, you know, a renewable energy future, but they've got a major bill in terms of trying to deal with the impacts of climate change, which they've done very little to cause in the end. And I think this is really, when we're thinking about ensuring that we tackle the climate crisis effectively, you know, I think many of you will be familiar with the fossil fuel divestment movement, which is about ensuring we remove our investments in fossil fuels. And a lot of that has been focused in the global north. And that's really makes a lot of sense, given that a lot of the financial institutions, a lot of the money, the capital is in the global north. But if we look to the history of the tobacco divestment movement, there's one thing that we really need to think carefully about, is that when the tobacco divestment was successful in the global north and there was a stigma against smoking, against tobacco, and strong regulations happened thanks to the success of the divestment movement, what the tobacco industry did then was move into the global south to less regulated countries, to less regulated spaces, right? And so I think what we're going to see with climate change is a very similar sort of experience, where the divestment movement is growing and it's really successful in the global north, and we're starting to see global Green New Deals taking place and significant progress on climate justice happening. Although, of course, there's much further to go for many countries, including the UK, on this front. But as that happens, there's going to be a rush for the fossil fuel industry to come to the global south, and we're seeing it all across the continent, where, you know, the fossil fuel industry is making a last rush to enter the global south, and to make it seem as if they're acting in the interest of the global south too. You know, they make claims that fossil fuels are the right road to development, but those claims are false. Really, when it comes to ensuring socially and ecologically just development, particularly with the rapid advances we've seen in renewable energy, the best route for development in much of the global south, in fact, most of the global south, if not all of it, is a renewable energy future, right? But the question is, how can we ensure that there is the capital there so that we can embrace that future? how can we ensure that we're not indebting the global south further in order for them to make that step? And so, ensuring that we're fighting the fossil fuel industry as it begins to retreat perhaps a bit more from the global north and tries to sink itself really into the global south. And I think there's particular need to pay attention to the role that gas will play. I think coal as an industry is really, we're starting to see it declining and struggling to gain investment, even the global south, which is not to say we shouldn't be fighting off the last vestiges of the coal industry. But there is this push for more fossil gas, more fracked gas, under the guise of it being a bridge fuel, when we know that really fossil gas contains significant impacts on the climate through methane, through leakage, and also through the burning of gas. And we also see, major harmful impacts in the drilling, in the fracking process itself. And so that's one of the big potential future growth areas of pollution is gas. And there's a big mad rush for gas on the African continent as well as oil. And so if we can, as a global climate justice movement, stand against the power of the fossil fuel industry as it begins to shift to the global south by cutting off the finance flows, by ensuring that our governments in the global north are also investing in a global Green New Deal. And that doesn't mean just like a token few $billion, as we've seen a lot of governments in the global north do. While they do trillion-dollar packages at home, it's maybe $2 billion for the rest of the globe in its entirety. And that in itself, I mean, it really is not up to the scale of what's needed. David Adler and Yanis Varoufakis propose something that's a little bit closer to the scale of what's required. And they propose something like an emergency organization for environmental and economic global development, which would funnel trillions of dollars into a global Green New Deal, rather than just the pithy billions of dollars which are being discussed in a lot of traditional UN climate spaces. So yeah, I thought I would just outline those various elements of what a global Green New Deal looks like, and kind of show how, when it comes to both COVID and vaccines and also climate justice, that we need to extend our sense of investing in climate justice well beyond our borders. To do so is both to realize the debt that is owed to those outside of us, but it is also to recognize that if we want to tackle the climate crisis, the necessity is to ensure that the whole globe can tackle it at once, because an emission or pollution emitted in South Africa or Mauritius or in Vietnam is an emission that goes into the global atmosphere. And so without a global Green New Deal, without global climate justice, then we simply won't get the climate crisis under control. And so we need to have Green New Deals at home, but we also need to ensure that there is a strong international climate justice element brought into them, and that we're working together and ensuring international cooperation to make that happen. So I'll leave it there, because I know I was going to do 15 to 20 minutes, and I think I'm in the sweet spot between 15 and 20 minutes, and open up to some questions and answers. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Alex. That was a brilliantly informative talk, and there's so much to discuss there. It's funny, at the end, you mentioned that coal is on its way out. You might not know, but the UK government has just approved a brand new coal mine in the north of England, which is not ideal. Anyway, we've had some excellent questions, so I'm going to get straight into them. First, from Mike, he says, how have governments responded to the global Green New Deal, which was proposed by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs?
Yeah, so I think that's a big question. And I think there's sometimes a problem with the label Green New Deal, is it sometimes gets thrown around and means 1,000 different things to different people. So for some, it's sort of like a mild version of reform that moves us towards renewable energy and kind of generally gets things going. But then there's the more radical visions of a global Green New Deal, which are about recognizing climate debt, that are about more transformative visions that work to fix the financial architecture of the globe, which creates that indebtedness, but also funnel so much in terms of funding towards fossil fuels and towards harmful forms of development. So if you look to places like the UN, Paris Climate Agreements, there was things like the need to fund the Green Climate Fund, which, global North countries promised $100 billion a year, but a lot of that was repurposed money. And so some of the vision of that was quite narrow in scope in terms of focusing on renewable energy, and not quite focusing on that broader transformative vision of a Green New Deal. So I think, for a lot of countries in the global South, there is really a sense that there has been a failure to recognize the real meaning of a radical global Green New Deal, which would work to make major investments in helping the global South to unlock that sort of future. And then it will also do away with things like intellectual property rights, which are preventing a lot of global South countries from investing in renewable energy. And so there's some precedent actually on this front in terms of in South Africa, where they fought against intellectual property rights in HIV/AIDS treatments in order to allow for broader diffusion of this. And similarly, there's been big calls for removing intellectual property rights around renewable energy technologies to make it more affordable, to make it more accessible. And another parallel, there was calls for this by South Africa and India for the COVID-19 vaccine, which were then pushed back against by countries in the global North, like the US, where big pharma companies have pretty strong influences on their policies. And similarly, when it comes to renewable energy, I think we sometimes, as campaigners, we like to cheer on renewable energy companies, and they're good because they're creating this technology. But there's also a profit drive there that sometimes gets in the way of climate justice. And so if we're trying to enable broader uptake of renewable energy in places where the finances are a challenge, then unlocking things like intellectual property rights and giving access to these sorts of technologies are another part of that global Green New Deal. So it's a bit of a long-winded way to say, there are maybe a much more moderate and not very radical vision. There is movement on the global Green New Deal, but when it comes to really transformative visions of upending the global infrastructure and architecture and putting in place something that can really enable deep transformation in the global South and the global North, we've got a very long way to go. There's a great report that came out from the United Nations, UNCTAD. They did a report on financing the global Green New Deal, which envisions what would be a bit more of a radical way of approaching this. So that's worth digging into in terms of trying to understand, what something a bit more transformative could look like.
Great, thanks. What was the name of that report you mentioned at the end?
So it's the United Nations UNCTAD financing a global Green New Deal. I can get a link for you and share it here too.
That'd be great, thank you. And my next question is from Danielle, and mixed in a bit of Kerry's question as well. She says, do you know of any countries or governments in the global South that recognise the damaging impacts of climate change and are leading the way by blocking this movement by oil and gas companies into the global South? And I think linked to that would be, are many countries in the global South in a position to stop investment if huge oil and gas companies want to set up shop there?
Yeah, so I mean, there are some countries that are leading the way in that front. One of them that comes to mind is Costa Rica. They ended new oil and gas exploration in their country altogether. They've operating on 100% renewable energy. They've got major reforestation efforts. So that's one really positive example there that has really been a shining light in showing the need to leave fossil fuels in the ground and the need to transition our renewable energy spaces. And also, it's a country where they invest in a robust social safety net, which allows them to be able to deal with some resistance that might come with that sort of transition. And I think that's a really important element of a Green New Deal, is having a populace that is relatively secure. So if you invest in a social safety net, if you invest in just transition policies, that can reduce a lot of the resistance to change. And I think this is where a lack of trust in whether the government will support you can be one of the biggest obstacles to making that sort of transformative transition. So that's where Costa Rica, I think, is a really interesting example. That being said, there's a lot of countries in the global south, South Africa included, that are quite captured by coal, oil, and gas interests. So our country, even though renewable energy is the cheapest, most affordable energy option in South Africa, because of vested interest, they're trying to force new coal power plants, and they're trying to force a lot of oil and gas exploration. And I think this speaks to, unfortunately, the role that the corruption of governments play across the world, where the fossil fuel industry captures them. And it's certainly not unique to the global south. We know that in places like the United States and Australia, the supposed Western democracies, that the fossil fuel industry has well captured them too. So I don't think corruption is uniquely a global south problem when it comes to our inaction on climate change. So I think there's difficulties that we face in many global south contexts where we need to fight against the unholy alliance of fossil capital and government policy. But there is certainly rich resistance against it. And one of the most important tools which could help us, I think, in those fights would be if the global north would be more willing to help invest in a global Green New Deal, which could help us leapfrog away from some of those technologies and help, with some of the resistance that comes to financing those sorts of shifts.
Thank you. And a question from Claire is, how far do you think will COP26, if it's effective, be able to address some of these issues? The ideas of Green New Deals have been around for over decades, and is this year going to make a difference?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I think in some ways it's important that we as a climate justice movement recognize how far we have come. We really have made major steps. Some of the broad commitments that we're seeing to net zero by 2050, which is not fast enough. And net zero is a really treacherous concept where you can hide a lot of pollution in it. But the fact that we're seeing like major new commitments coming out from countries across the world to net zero by 2050, if not before, I think is a major milestone. The fact that the US presidential candidates, or now the president, ran on Green New Style type policies, which would have, the previous elections, there was basically climate silence. So there has been transformative shifts in a lot of thinking around climate justice, and coming out of the heart of the US empire, which has such a big influence on global discussions because of their sort of hegemonic cultural power. I think that really marks a big possible change. At the same time, though, when you look at some of Biden's rhetoric about international climate change, it's through a security lens. So he sees like climate change internationally, we're going to deploy the military perhaps rather than deploy a global Green New Deal. And when they talk about investing in the Global Green Climate Fund, the amounts are like 8 billion versus someone like Bernie Sanders, who is going to say that we needed to invest hundreds of billions to ensure broader transformative action, or like the Green Party in the US, which actually had a much more ambitious transformative platform, which was about defunding the military and investing a huge amount in the Global Green New Deal, which didn't quite get anywhere near the attention it deserved. And so, there's the sense that, there is a big push for climate action, but whether an international climate action, but it's not clear that it's going to be of a Global Green New Deal that really pays attention properly to these questions of climate justice and what's really owed to the Global South in a lot of this.
Right, thank you. From going on from what you said, how obviously we need to get people in the global north more on side and willing to pressure their governments to invest and give foreign aid, etc. How can we get more people in the UK who aren't necessarily seeing severe effects of climate change yet to care more and vote for these policies. Ellie's made a point that a lot of people are worried about numbers of refugees, either from a compassionate standpoint or from a threat to national security. And is it better to get people to care about climate change for the sake of it, or play on that cynicism and make people worried that more refugees are going to come?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. In some ways, you would have thought that some of the most strong advocates for strong global climate action would be the anti-refugee crowd, but it seems like there's some cognitive dissonance where they are often climate deniers too, and so are the ones that would actually lead to more climate migrants, climate refugees. And so how to appeal to that crowd, I think, is a challenging one, given some ideological distortions which perhaps drive some of their resistance to climate action. And also, I think we need to recognize that there's a very clear propaganda campaign driven by like a noxious mix of fossil fuel companies and billionaire that do enable this sort of right-wing sort of populism. And we can see, yeah, that there's a significant element of that. And so I think working to address that is important. But how do we encourage people to get involved? I think this can be really tricky because it does involve an education around global climate justice and around colonialism and histories of climate change impacts there. And so, I think there is a sense of appealing to the fact that, in order to tackle climate change and to protect themselves, and that we need it to be global. And so that's one way of highlighting why there should be more on this front. But I do think that, the question of justice and what is owed is not something that should be lost either. And I think people, given the right sort of framing, given the right sort of space, will be able to understand that. But I think there needs to be quite a bit more done to put emphasis on this. And I think this is part of the worry, is that when we look at a lot of movements in the global north, and there are some notable examples, there just isn't an emphasis on this. And so I think a big part of it is talking more about what is owed. And I'm really glad that you folks are having this sort of discussion, and I wish more would do that. I mean, it's not that talk by itself is sufficient, but if you have active campaigns that are going on around this, if you have solidarity campaigns speaking to the connection with the global south. So for example, on the 19th of March, there's going to be the next global climate strike. And I know a lot of the African youth that I've been speaking to are going to be campaigning on this particular issue. So working to lift up their voices too, and to ensure that, you're elevating that in other spaces, I think is really important.
That's a really great answer. Thank you, Alex. If I can do one, and keep this question brief because otherwise it could possibly go on for a long time. Mike's question is, can governments across the world end their addiction to GDP growth and endlessly increasing consumer consumption? If we don't end the rating countries based on GDP, are we going to be able to tackle the climate crisis?
That's a really wonderful, but also a very big question. So I think there's no doubt that we need to move away from GDP. Sitting here in the South African context, the emphasis on growing our economy when you're in one of the world's most unequal economies, not the most, means that you're growing an economy that's giving so much to just a few, right? And the thing is that the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality in South Africa, which is about 0.69, if you look at the global Gini efficient, it's about the same, right? And so the world's economy is structured similarly in terms of inequalities to apartheid South Africa, right? So that tells you a lot about global GDP, who it serves, right? And when we also think about climate change, the top 1%, the richest top 10% are typically those that contribute the most to it. So I think in any discussion about GDP, we've got to recognize who it serves the most, right? and who's also most responsible for the problem. But at the same time, I think we also, when we think about degrowth and the need to move away from GDP, I think at the same time we recognize that there are those that are consuming way too much. We also need to think about the fact that there are many that can't even meet their basic needs. And so at the same time that we degrow the harmful elements for our economy, we really need to put emphasis on investing in those that can't meet their needs at the same time. And so I think sometimes degrowth can be seen as like anti-development, but I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. It can be more about ensuring that we're getting everybody up to a level of sufficiency while putting a sort of a ceiling on harmful and really problematic forms of development. And so I think it's clear that, you know, narrow focus on GDP is doing incredible harm, and, you know, it takes things that are counted on the positive ledger in GDP are often harmful things, whether it's pollution or police or installing barbed wire on your house. That all is positive on the GDP front, whereas a lot of negative impacts, such as, you know, environmental pollution and so on, are not really counted at all on the GDP ledger. So I think it's quite clear we need to move beyond that globally, but at the same time that, you know, we might focus more on degrowth in, say, a global north setting. It's perhaps a little bit different in some of the global south settings, where we're thinking more about growing in a way that isn't just about GDP, but is about ensuring that we are bringing people's quality of life up in a way that's both sustainable, but is also socially and economically just.
I can see a lot of nodding on my screen. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that's the end of the question and answer session, part of the talk. So I say thank you on behalf of everyone here. That was a really brilliant talk, and thanks especially for some really insightful answers to the questions that we put to you.